65,000 people with dementia in New Zealand. Currently, people think that might be about mid-70s or so. But by the time we hit 2050, this will be probably the order of 170,000. And it's an issue also, increasing longevity in people that marry is really good. But the number of married over 80 years of age has doubled substantially recently, and that therefore puts them in greater risk. And there is variation as to when dementia may occur in individuals. And in married on average, the diagnosis occurs 8 years earlier than people that have aphakia, and about 3 years earlier than those who are Pacific. Now, obviously, many of us will be sitting there, including myself, standing here and thinking, all right, I often forget things. I often have lapses of attention. The reality is, as we age, our cognitive or thinking faculties tend to wane a little bit. But seriously speaking, the occasional lapse of attention, the occasional loss of remembering something is not in itself important. So it's fairly normal that people would do that. And the way I try and get this across to people is, if we had sort of lapses of attention and poor memory as our criterion by itself for people showing dementia, I can assure you the vast bulk of my students at university are demented. So clearly then, there is something much more substantial than that that's going on. So something to do with dementia is well beyond of the aging, let's say. It's something far in excess of that. It's qualitatively different as well. And the problem, of course, is that underlying this, there'll be some kind of brain degeneration that's happening. So as there's more brain degeneration taking place, then the ability to function on an everyday basis is what declines. And the critical thing that's behind here is, the critical single thing that makes a difference is whether or not you're able to lead a truly independent life for yourself. Whether you're able to undertake those everyday activities that we all take normally for granted. If those begin to fail, then very probably at that point, someone may say that the diagnosis of dementia warranted. But getting there takes a long, long time. Many of us, thankfully, do not get there, even though our cognitive faculties may begin to wane as we age. The critical thing then is to do with what was your previous level. Some people had, their ability to think very clearly during life, for one reason or another, might not be so great. The critical thing is it a change from the past? Is it change relative to where you were before? And how serious is that change relative to your ability to function on an everyday basis? And so a lot of it that's going on is rather insidious and progressive, and in many instances relatively slow. And therefore it makes it hard to determine what's happening. But a lot of the research that's been undertaken in recent times is to better understand the nature of that process and what's happening and how we might change the course of that process. So one thing to remember, and top of the list then, so there are a few things I want to try and get across in particular. At the top of the list perhaps immediately is, dementia is no one single thing. There are many different kinds of dementia that exist. So it's rather an umbrella term for a whole range of a group of diseases whose general symptoms overlap by the fact that they impair someone in one way or another in their ability to live a normal everyday life relative to their age. So failure to be truly independent, relative obviously to the ability to be independent, or relative to other kinds of physical ailments that might be problematic in terms of being independent. Those are the things that are critical. Thank you for one more thing. And what's behind all of this? Well, top of the list, there are a variety of what's described as misbehaving proteins that exist in the brain. They're responsible for normal brain function. I'm talking about one or two of those in a sec. The other thing, though, although we have an excessive focus on that for good reason, the other thing that's really important when we begin to think about risk and prevention is to do with the brain's blood supply. More and more, we're realizing that that's a critical part of whether or not that tips someone over into actually getting to the point of serious cognitive decline, failure for everyday function, and therefore diagnosis of dementia. And another part that's to do with that is sort of slightly related to infectious type processes that might be happening. But some of these are directly related to infection, and some of them are just sort of normal responses you'd expect in the brain. So something called neuroinflammation is also, we think, playing an important part. It's the combination of all these things that are critical. And the issue then becomes, to what extent can we actually influence any of these? And we'll look at some of those things shortly. Thank you. So what are the different kinds? Well, everybody's heard of Alzheimer's disease, and the vast bulk of people with dementia will be suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Now, the estimates for this do vary depending on who you listen to. Most people are quite satisfied that probably about 50%. In other words, only half of all dementias are caused by what's described as Alzheimer's disease. And you can see over here, a dementia process that's primarily driven by vascular problems in the brain is maybe the order of 15%. Things like Parkinson's disease, which is a motor disorder, we know now that over time, at least 50%, some people think maybe 75% or more of people with Parkinson's will eventually progress also to Parkinson's with dementia. And there are related kind of disorders that have the same biological signature related to that too, and that might be roughly, let's say, another 50%. And there's a whole raft of other things that exist also. Some of them might be alcohol related, some of them might be due to different kinds of infections in the brain that can occur. And also there's a raft of different kinds of what's described as frontotemporal dementias. Some of those are to do with very severe problems in language, and some of them are rather unusual. They're more to do with sudden changes or exacerbation of odd behavior that people might have. And they may be driven perhaps by slightly different processes happening in different regions of the brain. They are linked together because two different regions get affected, but maybe a slightly different mix. Thank you. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, and that kind of bolsters our need to understand the neurobiology behind different kinds of dementias is that in recent times, so for Alzheimer's disease, the critical thing that stands out early in Alzheimer's disease is very poor memory, far in excess of what you might expect of someone of their age. And what they've discovered is that a lot of people over the age of 80 might have a clinical presentation that looks very much like Alzheimer's disease. But when they looked at the brain's post-mortem, they discovered there's a very different protein problem taking place that's still affecting some of the critical systems that we know to be affected in Alzheimer's, but rather caused by something else. And because this occurs in people over 80, the reason is not because of that, but rather it gets aptly named late as an acronym. But the latest research, what the latest research is really telling us, and I think this is fairly critical, is that while we're kind of obsessed with all these different kinds of dementia, and all the different kinds of problems that might be giving rise to different kinds of dementia, what's really happening, especially as we age, is a mixture of different types of abnormalities. And a big one behind that, of course, might be cerebrovascular problems. A big one behind that might be a whole host of other things that might be influencing the quality of your metabolism. Gosh, I haven't run this wave of slides since my very first conference, way back, and I won't tell you when because it was before the age of dawn. Anyway, so what we're after then is to try to understand at first for what about those proteins? Now, a whole raft of enormous number of proteins are important in the brain. They're all generated by our genes in different ways, and they have to be regulated very, very carefully. And cells have an enormous array of mechanisms to actually cope with those proteins and say to themselves, in inverted commas, oh, that protein's not right, let's get rid of it. So it's a complex issue with a bunch of things going on. And really what lots of people are trying to do therefore is to try to understand the biological signature behind each of those different types of dementia processes. If we can understand the biological signature, and if we can understand the biochemistry, maybe we can find ways to treat those different kinds of abnormalities that may occur. But remember, to reiterate, we think now that that's probably an oversimplification. And why is that important? That's important because all too often what we're looking for are magic bullets for A, or a different bullet for B, and a different bullet for C. And really perhaps what we've been missing is that all of these things are complicated and interacting together, and a whole bunch of lifestyle issues might be important too, that at the end of the day, tip the balance as to whether someone will or will not show dementia. So here, for example, now the diagram is a bit complicated, but to put it in a nutshell, it's the following. There may be individual molecules, individual proteins that have critically important jobs. And the issue is that sometimes those proteins go slightly awry. And when they go slightly awry, sometimes what happens is the proteins begin to clump together. And when they begin to clump together, sometimes they attract more proteins to go awry and clump together with them. And in the process of doing that, so two things are important. One is, as they begin to clump together and begin to go awry, they actually become toxic to the natural environment of the cell. And the cell then starts getting into trouble, and that cell will eventually start deteriorating and die, and will have progressive brain degeneration as a consequence. But the other thing is, well, Where does it start? Does it start everywhere in the brain? Well, different kinds of protein problems occur in slightly different places in the brain. But what we think now is that somehow, as those proteins become misbehaved and start to begin to come together and begin to become toxic, they actually self-seed themselves and make other normal proteins that are behaving themselves to now misbehave, and it spreads. And so we need to learn more and more about how we can minimize the spread of those abnormal proteins. Thank you. So here, what about Alzheimer's disease? Well, the two key proteins of relevance here are things called amyloid and things called tau. So they provide two different markers in the brain. So the first one, amyloid, is something whereby if we look at brain tissue, we find what's described as plaques, or tiny little microscopic lesions that occur just out, for the most part, just outside and in between cells, and they stop the cells working together. Secondly, the tau protein is normally responsible for a whole manner of things. It's kind of like the skeleton inside the neuron, but what it also does is enable normal trafficking of all sorts of substances backwards and forwards to make the neuron work properly. So if you imagine if your skeleton starts to fail, your body will start to fail. And the same thing happens in a neuron. As the skeleton starts to fail, all the functions of that neuron start to fail. So in Alzheimer's disease, critically, there must be these two different abnormalities. And that's very important because perhaps a lot of the literature, basically what's been taking place in the past, you go to a conference and there's a bunch of people who think amyloid is the critical thing. That's the thing that's going to cure Alzheimer's. And then there's another bunch of people who don't have as loud a voice, I should say, who say tau is the thing that's most important. And then the first lot say, yes, but in Alzheimer's disease, amyloid is the thing that's different. Tick. And then they say in tau, you can get tau in all sorts of other kinds of dementia conditions. And in any case, there's some evidence that, even in very young people, there may be a teeny bit of abnormal tau. So how can that be really connected to Alzheimer's disease? And the problem is, again, narrow thinking. It's thinking there's one bullet that we need to tackle instead of multiple bullets. Here are clearly two processes we need to tackle at the same time, but there are many other things we need to do as well. So what happens then? If you look at the Alzheimer's brain, at the top is a normal brain. So the cortical folds are extremely thick, and down below we can see an example of someone with Alzheimer's disease, and this will be relatively steady Alzheimer's. You can see very clearly on the two pictures of the brain, a huge loss of tissue is taking place. But inside the brain, there are also lots of other changes taking place too. So at the top on the right, there's, as it were, brain imaging has taken place, so we can take imaginary slices through someone's brain. And if you look there, where do we see seahorses? There's a place where, in particular, many people think is critical for Alzheimer's disease, in the sense of degeneration in that structure might be one of the main important things that give rise to memory loss in individuals. And you can see very clearly from the top to the bottom that the huge shrinkage of that tissue. But if you look carefully, there's also two other colours there, the green one and the blue one. And now what we think is that actually it's the problems in the green and the blue in particular. And some of those structures are very unusual in the human brain compared to other animals. And maybe some abnormalities start there and spread to the hippocampus and then spread to other places. There's still quite a debate about that. I'll be honest, I'm in one of the camps that thinks, no, there are other problems taking place as well. And it's not just this region. But the point of this is the hippocampus. So here's the second thing that's critical for people to remember. Neuroscientists are a funny bunch. Well, we're all funny bunches in our different ways, aren't we? One of the things about neuroscience is that they are obsessed with the hippocampus. And part of that might be because when you look at the internal structure of the hippocampus, it is naturally a beautiful structure to look at. There's no question whatsoever. It also has a rather strange name, hippocampus. It's kind of like in itself, something that's alluring and mystical. And it comes from way back, well, the origination of hippocampus comes from the Latin. And I think the Romans pinched it from the Greeks. So the Greeks used to say hippocampus, and the Romans thought, no, we need an ancient like that in terms of, language, etc. But basically, what were they doing? Why is it called hippocampus? And the answer to many brain structures is very simple. Way back in the day, what people were doing was simply looking at a brain, looking at bits of brain, and saying to themselves, oh, I wonder what that looks like. So there might be a large part of the brain that someone decided looks like a great big belt, and they called it the belt. And there may be another part of the brain where they thought, oh, this looks like an inner chamber, so they called it the inner chamber. But back in the day, of course, the international language would not like today be English. It would be Latin with a sprinkling of Greek thrown in if you wanted to really be posh. And effectively then, what they called it is the seahorse. They thought it looked like a seahorse. They therefore called it the hippocampus. Now this is valuable because if we go around telling people that my focus on the brain, our obsession is the seahorse on the brain, and then you add, by the way, you have two seahorses, not just one. It starts to get a bit strange. But if you tell them we're really obsessed with a place called hippocampus, don't mean, and it sounds jolly scientific. We go to the next slide though. So this one shows where the hippocampus itself lives inside the brain. So here's the sort of brain imaging done by an eminent, and I shouldn't say tall scientist, so it's not mine. I'm sure my brain's nowhere near as good as this one, where you can see then the position of the hippocampus. And part of the reason that this feels like a special place is it seems to live in its own little special compartment inside the brain. It seems to be sort of physically slightly separate to anything else. So now I often look at it and I think, no, it looks more like a sausage. But sausage isn't so romantic as the hippocampus. So we have to stick with the hippocampus and go from there. So what about some of these protein changes that will take place in the brain? The top two are the ones shown with respect to Alzheimer's. So let's focus on those two first. One thing you'll notice, which I think is critically important, which a lot of people who are obsessed with amyloid, I think, miss, is that the actual development of the amyloid plaques is occurring very often in cortical structures and moving down towards the brain stem. Whereas the Alzheimer tangles tend to start in lower cortical structures and also in the brainstem and move upwards. So the trajectory of these two things doesn't overlap. So, can one be more important than the other? Maybe it's the mixture of the both of them in certain places that makes a critical difference. If we look at Parkinson's disease, the abnormality there is something that gives rise to, the protein there gives rise to complications called Lewy bodies. And the Lewy bodies, without question, in the majority of people with Parkinson's disease, will start very much in the brainstem. In fact, some people think they might be starting way back in the gut and traversing from there and causing abnormalities that go all the way up to the brain and progress from there. But there's another group of people in whom the abnormality starts somewhere else in the brain, if they also have the same, what appears on the surface, the same Parkinson's syndrome. And then there are other things like motor neuron disease that have a DNA protein problem. And that DNA protein problem can occur in different places and give rise to different kinds of disorders too. So there's a variety of different signatures that exist. But remember, in many people, there may be a very mixture of these, and the dominant one will be what gives rise to your dominant diagnosis, but by itself might not be enough. And I said before that this takes time. So it's not that, well, I don't know if it's good or bad. We don't wake up one day and think to ourselves, oh, now I'm demented. Generally speaking, it's something that probably takes place in the order of 10, 20, 30. Some people think all the way back, maybe in some instances, right to the age of 10 or earlier, something might be starting to go wrong. That will lead at some point in life to you having a diagnosis of dementia. It's a huge lifespan set of problems taking place. And as that happens then, remember I said that dementia is very different to normal aging. Well, you don't just go from being normal with your normal level of cognitive ability as you're older and suddenly having dementia. These things change and shift over time. So there's an intermediate stage that people call mild cognitive impairment, which sounds relatively benign, but actually may not be. In the sense it's very, very different to normal aging. That might be an intermediate step. And lots of people are trying to understand better some of those biological signals that we talked about in that context. And so different things that happen in the brain occur at different rates of time. So amyloid changes definitely occur earlier in life in those who will get Alzheimer's disease, and other changes like tau or loss of brain tissue happen later in life. And so people are trying to understand the dynamic trajectory of those different markers over time in order to be able to better identify people who might be in trouble, because the sooner you intervene with someone who's starting to lose brain tissue, the better it will be. When I started out life in science, I remember talking to some of the, guy now is probably one of the most famous scientists in the world, and it was after a conference and we were having a quick bevy and we decided that, well, okay, well, we lose brain tissue, all we have to do is put some brain tissue back in, and tongue in cheek, Well, we thought maybe by Monday we'll get Parkinson's cured, maybe your Alzheimer's will be a bit trickier, and maybe that'll take till Friday. Here I am several decades later, and I doubt it's going to happen in my lifetime. But it kind of belies the fact that we have too simplistic a view as to what's happening here. And really a better understanding is actually appreciating some of the variety and complexities and interrelationships that happen across all these different disorders. Now, thank you. Next one. Maybe I've got 2 slides on. Thank you. Now, back in the early 2000s, it was estimated that basically, if we could slow down the progression to dementia, just by 5 years, then probably you might stop half the number of people getting dementia itself. Because as we age, other things will get us. And so the whole argument was, well, we need to get in there early, slow it down, keep people relatively healthy, and then they'll die from something else instead of dementia. And that's not a bad thing. Because if I had the choice, well, it would depend, I suppose. It depends on the nature of what it is. But most of the time, most of us would rather keep our mental faculties until somebody else gets us. And then, what really surprised people, though, was that around that time and soon thereafter, people began to gather more and more information on all these sort of epidemiological long-term studies that they had. And they realized that what's taking place is that, right, populations are aging. So we can work out exactly how many people should get dementia in the future, and oh dear, we're in trouble, what are we going to do about this? But they then realized that the actual growth and the rate of dementia cases, although increasing largely because of the aging population, were not increasing as much as they should have been. And if some, and people have looked at this, and this all sort of goes back probably to mostly those since about the middle of the last century. Some people think it goes back to about 1930. If you look at people over time, there seems to be fewer, relative to the aging population, number of people with dementias than you might expect. If this is happening, we haven't suddenly changed our genetics in that time. If this is happening, if the rates of dementia are lower than we might anticipate, even though they're growing because of the aging population, something else is going on. If we can understand there's something else is going on, maybe we now have a window as actually how we might learn better about what's happening, and more than that, how we might begin to think about how we might treat and prevent different kinds of dementia. And basically, this slide encapsulates a lot of that. What's happening, what we've begun to realize is that over here at the bottom, we've got neuropathology. Left is low, towards the right is high. When you have high neuropathology, you may have dementia. But there are many individuals who at post-mortem had relatively high neuropathology in the brain, but they did not have dementia. Now, there's no question that those abnormalities can lead to dementia. So what's the difference between those who do and those who don't? Is there some kind of resilience that might occur in some individuals that if we could understand better, we could vastly reduce or improve the lifespan of individuals, even those who will progress to dementia later in life? So building resilience in the brain is a critical part of all of this. Improving our chances. Now, when we talk about this, everyone thinks, well, I did X, I did Y, and I did Z. So why have I got dementia? Why did my spouse get dementia? And the answer is because there's a huge number of things that tip the balance one way or another. Thank you. So in recent times, what people have started to do is to look at the things through life that seem to influence the rate of dementia and whether or not we can change those. So it's been estimated that about 30% of dementia cases that occur are related to factors that we can modify. In other words, there are risk factors that are modifiable. And if we can understand those factors better and learn more and more, which is what a lot of people are doing these days, the more we can tip the balance for more and more individuals so they have, relatively speaking, a healthy lifespan. So at the top, there in blue is early in life, green is roughly in midlife, and pinky brown is roughly in late life. And you can see that they put various aspects to many of those as to things that we think are related to the probability of getting dementia and that can be modified. And one of the biggies there is in education. There's no question whatsoever that higher levels of education are associated with lower levels of dementia later in life. Now, does this mean that someone who's been a professor for 30 years will never get dementia? I can assure you not. Does it mean the proportion of dementias in those individuals is lower? Then the answer is yes. Is the proportion of people with dementia who hardly any schooling higher than those who have more schooling? The answer is unequivocally yes. So we can change through education a huge chunk of the probability of people getting dementia later in life. But you can see there are many other things too. So over on the left, it says reduce brain damage. So changing your vascular risk, changing neurotoxins associated with things that might happen during life. Like, for example, late life smoking, for example, diabetes, hypertension, serum cholesterol. All of those will tip the balance towards you having a greater probability of having dementia. And therefore, dealing with those will tip the balance towards reducing the probability that you will have dementia. In the same way, there are many things, over in the bottom down there, it says diet. Well, there's no one single diet that's going to cure, I know there's a book called The End of Dementia that says, okay, here's the diet that you have to have, and here's the other things you have to do, and this will cure dementia, because I've treated 100 patients and they're all fine. The problem with things like that is they very often haven't gone through scientific scrutiny. And there's no way it's as simple as that. But there is an answer embedded in there, and the answer to do with diet is just the better quality, the better variation of the diet that you have. Then there's no question that also reduces the balance towards whether someone has a probability of dementia or not. So we're starting to get lots of balls up in the air here that might have an influence and change the probability of what's taking place. And in the middle, of course, are things like exercise too, which play an enormous role across all of these in different ways. So now, genes. There's no question that we all have a different mix of genes. You have a different mix of genes compared to your parents, but even though you inherited them from your parents, because you've got two parents, there may be some of the genes that you inherit, some you don't. There are many different individual genes that might predispose you very strongly towards dementia, and others that don't, that might be protected. Now, one of the genes that's very important is something called ApoE, and this seems to be a general gene that has a general effect on dementias no matter what kind they are, or virtually what kind they are. And this gene codes for a protein that helps the body deal with lipids. They deal with fats. And the way in which fats get dealt with is important. And if you have one of the genes that's labeled ApoE4, in other words, people can have different variants, but if you've got at least one or two of those genes, a pair of genes that are ApoE1 or two genes that are ApoE4, your chances of getting dementia are elevated. And this study demonstrates very clearly that that is influenced very strongly by education. So if you have the ApoE4 gene, you will have a much elevated risk of dementia. And if we look, for example, just focusing on dementia in general here, if there's low level of education to a high level of education, the dark bars are always higher than the light bars. There's no question that that gene increases your risk. Yet, if you look at the people who have a high level of education, irrespective of whether you're a dark or a low bar, you have a much lower risk than those who had a low level of education, irrespective of whether they had the gene that will predispose you to a dementia later in life. So clearly then, things like this will make a huge difference. So what I'm busy telling students at university is, make sure you get to university because then you have lots of years of education. Make sure you stay there, and having stayed there, make sure you go back. Because after all, at this point in time, students don't have to pay interest on their loans. A little while ago, you didn't even have to pay back your loan, but now I've heard that you have to, beyond $20,000 a year, you have to start paying back your loan. It's a no-brainer. You just stay at university forever. Now, some people might be thinking, yeah, but okay, I did go to university, or I didn't go to university, and now I'm older. What can I do now? And the answer, quite frankly, is no, it can still make a difference. There's some work coming out of Australia, I think it was primarily done in Tasmania, that indicated that people, retired individuals, going back to university, the quality of their cognition would improve also as a consequence of doing that. So although it's something where the footprint is embedded early in life, there's no question that that's important. Later in life, it can make a difference too. How does that work then? Well, basically, the difference is you might still get neuropathology taking place, but your brain seems to be able to better cope with that neuropathology. Fundamentally, what's taking place is early in life, The better your conditions, the better your brain will be, and therefore the better the brain will be able to cope with neuropathology that happens. But more than that, also it improves the quality of how the brain operates. And that in itself might be enough to prevent you actually succumbing. So you see here, people with low reserve might have a lower memory test score, for example, and they'll progress to dementia, and they progress to dementia earlier. Those who have a high reserve will only start progressing much later, even though in those individuals, when it happens, it may be a faster fall. But we would all of us rather stay a healthy lifespan for longer. And so early education, cognitive activity throughout life, including late in life, has a huge influence. And here's an example of combining that now with both physical, social, and mental activity. And they looked at individuals who had become demented. And then they went back and asked, okay, how long did it take before you got demented in the study? And was that related to the general life that you had? And the answer was a very affirmative yes. And there are many other studies like that too. So clearly then, the more variety of activity and involvement we have in the world, the more likely this is to delay our actual impact of dementia. It won't necessarily stop us getting it, but like I said much earlier, the longer you have a healthy lifespan, the better your life is. So even though you might not say, well, this is going to prevent you getting dementia in entirety, if it means you get dementia when you're 100 instead of when you're 75, most of us would think that that's quite a good thing. In that respect then, basically what we end up is a picture like this. At the very center are our genes. Now we don't get a choice about our genes, much like we don't get a choice about our brothers and sisters sometimes. So in effect then, your genes are what you've got, and that will produce who you are in many respects. But who you are in many respects is then shaped by the environment, because genes don't work in isolation. And many genes get turned on and off, work together in different ways, depending on the nature of the environment in which those genes live. So who you are in the second circle will make a difference. How you respond to stress will make a difference. That will have an influence on your information in the brain. And then if you go to the middle circle there, or the second one out, you see there's a variety of different lifestyle and behavioral choices that will be important. And then outside that will be the external environment. And one of the ones that where clearer information is coming out these days is the quality environment in which we live also independently has an influence. So if you live somewhere where there's a high particulate matter in the air, in other words, air pollution, your risk of dementia is increased relative to other people who are otherwise identical living somewhere else. Next one. But basically what we have to do then is to translate this back into research. And how do we do that? Well, part of it is, for example, at the top, having clinical cohorts. So the NZBRI is a very large and growing longitudinal cohort of people where we focus primarily on Parkinson's disease. We look at many other things too, but that's our primary cohort. And what we have to do is to understand the genes involved in those people. We have to understand the metabolism associated with those people. And ideally, we would then feed all the way through to population-based studies. So what we've been missing so far, I think, and we're starting to look at now, is the idea of looking at populations in New Zealand and those at risk of Parkinson's. And then the thing in addition to them is to understand who has the markers early in life that puts you at risk and how may we modify those. Some of those may be modifiable and some of those may be not, depending on the particular type of dementia condition that someone may have. And the message is the following then. Basically, in a nutshell, there are a variety of things we need to do. And it's not just focusing only on the obvious biological underpinnings behind the disorder. Lifestyle can have a huge influence also. So level of education at the top is clearly important. General cognitive activity throughout life is important. Physical activity is clearly very important too. Social interactions are important as well, because human beings are social beings. And although we might sometimes not like some of those other social beings, focus on the ones you do like, because social interaction is a critical part of what makes us human. Also, a whole raft of sort of medical issues: diabetes, hypertension, smoking, alcohol. I've got alcohol question mark there for the following reason. Because I often get asked, okay, alcohol, I've heard some stories about alcohol being good for the brain, and other stories about alcohol is bad for the brain, and so on and so forth. The answer is the following: large amounts of alcohol, bad. Simple. Okay. Zero alcohol, to be honest, the evidence suggests, at least in populations like ours, absolute zero alcohol raises your risk of dementia just slightly, but not as much as lots of alcohol. And people often describe moderate amounts of alcohol are the best. And then you ask, well, what is that moderate level of alcohol? And to be honest, for most of us, that really means low levels of alcohol, because we struggle with knowing when moderate and too much is. There is no question whatsoever that binging on alcohol is super bad. There's absolutely the same in terms of prenatal alcohol effects. Because I've talked about things occurring, from birth onwards, and the answer is much earlier than that. The answer is, very much also to do with how the fetus develops. And how the fetus develops is also to do with how the parent develops. And they are all intertwined with each other. And binge alcohol drinking is seriously bad for the neural system that uses the seahorse. And that's clearly a big issue prenatally, but it's also a big issue later in life. Things like depression and mood and sensory loss. So there's a lot of work these days suggesting that hearing loss might be a major contributor or predictive factor of people who then progress to dementia. But we don't really know which way around this is. Some people think all you have to do is cure hearing loss and you won't get dementia. Now, I personally don't believe that. I think it will have an influence. Other people, who I think are probably more on the right track, is that maybe the hearing loss might actually be a good signal for us to begin to learn better at an earlier point in time when someone is in trouble. I talked before about Parkinson's, and one of the big sensory losses in Parkinson's that's a key there, long before the person is actually diagnosed with Parkinson's, is a loss of the sense of smell. And so many of these peripheral things might be important. We're learning more and more about how to get signals in the blood, so we don't always have to look in the brain. That might then enable us to target which people might be in trouble, where we then focus more and more intensive work to learn more about it. But in essence, the picture is the following. The simple message is what's good for the heart is good for the brain. What's good for the brain is good for the heart. And doing those will not necessarily cure dementia, but reduce the number of people who do get dementia, if not at least delay it. And many of those things, like metabolic disorders like diabetes, cardiovascular problems, are things that we are already good at treating. We've had enormous success in improving those. And so these are things we can do. We can make sure, for example, that people have a lower risk of going to diabetes. Now, there's a report just recently saying that the level of diabetes is going to skyrocket in the future, especially in certain portions of the population. We can do things about that. That in itself will then flow through to a whole host of other improvements in people's lives and improvements in reducing the risk of dementia down the track. Last slide. So clearly, then, here's some of my next generation, and they need the answers. Now, will the answers happen in my lifetime? I think the concrete answers won't happen in my lifetime, but they sure will happen my days.
Thank you, John. And before we break for some morning tea, just a couple of things. I mentioned earlier that this is Brain Awareness Month, which finishes at the end of March. As part of our promotion of that, which is a global technology brain research, we're asking the people of Canterbury to support NZBRI. Now, a big part of the funding required to undertake the research is from public donations and requests. But to ask people for money, firstly, you've got to actually help who we are and what we do. So really do appreciate your attendance today. We've also got another talk early next week on Parkinson's. Transition to people. There are some clients here if you'd like to take those. We'll have time available early next week. But also to acknowledge the importance of the research and the money that we need to raise to support that. We've got a little promotion as well, and we're going to put out some names this morning. Hopefully, those that are called out in attendance. The Celosia flower, which is also known as the brain flower,